It's raining, and I'm happy because I love the rain. And also, I'm not baking myself alive inside this car, so that's a really nice change. I have a thought that I've been having for a long time. It's more of a question. It's kind of theoretical stuff. Like, I don't know any way that people will be able to prove this one way or another, but it's just a mind tickler about transgenderism, specifically autoandrophilia and autogynephilia. So the question that I've always had is, where does autoandrophilia, because I'm an autoandrophile, but this works for autogynephilia as well, where does AAP originate? When I started to think that I was maybe transgender, the thing that I thought was, okay, well, this is something that is a part of my personality because it's been with me throughout my life and it's been pretty constant, and it's worked its way into my sexuality because there's sexual stuff that comes with this, but it would make sense if it was always part of my personality that it would be a part of my sexuality as well, because this is who I am as a person altogether. And so, I look back to the time in my life before I started to develop any sense of my sexuality and to develop any awareness of my sexuality. And I was always kind of like this. So it's like, well, okay, this is a part of my personality that kind of worked its way into my sexuality because as I became a sexual being and developed into adulthood, this, would naturally affect my sexuality as well. Then I discovered Ray Blanchard's work, and I kind of started trying to be brutally honest with myself about the idea that this was autoandrophilia. You're not transgender per se, you're an autoandrophile, which is a variant of transgenderism, but then you get into the, am I a transsexual? Well, no, I don't want to transition, so I guess I'm just transgender. I'm just me. Blanchard's idea, or at least the idea that I got listening to Blanchard's work, was that this was a sexual thing. Now, Blanchard is a sexologist, so of course he would look at this as a sexual thing, but this is a sexual thing that would then branch its way outward into a person's personality. And that created this really interesting chicken and egg question for me, because I started looking at it as like, okay, if I identify as an autoandrophile, which, let's be honest, there's some stuff here that's pretty autoandrophilic. In that case, it's a sexual thing that branched outward into my personality. It affects multiple areas of my personality, but it originates in my sexuality. Then I started thinking about it some more. I talked with some autogynephiles. Some people on here have messaged me, and I've had some really wonderful conversations with you guys. That's guys, girls, folks. It's awesome. And so, thank you. After a while of thinking about it and pondering it, and just realizing that a lot of the earlier autoandrophilic experiences that I had weren't about my sexuality. It was much more, I enjoy being perceived as male. It just feels very right to me. It feels very right to be the way I am. So then I start going back, and it's like, okay, well, there is that chicken and egg. I was listening to this interview, and Blanchard had this quote, which I'm going to put up here because if I try to quote it myself, I'm going to misquote it. But there's a certain open-endedness to it that even he seems to acknowledge in his statement there. Now, granted, it wasn't a thought-out, written-out statement. It was part of an interview, so he might have misspoken, but it does still leave that open-ended element to it. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is autogynephilia or autoandrophilia a part of a person's personality that threads its way into their sexuality as it moves throughout the entirety of their personality? Or is it something that originates in a person's sexuality that threads its way into a person's personality? Does it make a difference at the end of the day? Probably not. Are we ever going to be able to figure out which of these two things it is? Probably not. But it's a very interesting question. It's a very interesting question, at least for me. It's something that I can ponder and mull over. And I kind of suspect that from individual to individual, it's going to vary. Some people, it's pretty obvious to them personally that it was something that was very sexual. They started out, their sexuality bloomed and developed as they went through puberty, and they looked and it was like, okay, I'm very much like this. And then it kind of affects their preferences in life as they go through life. I think it's going to vary by the individual. Here's the really tricky thing with human psychology. Just because I think that I am, for instance, an autoandrophile where it's my personality and then it threads into my sexuality, that doesn't guarantee that it is like that. It just means that superficially, consciously, I assume that's how it works. But there's always the subconscious that a person needs to be somewhat aware of, and that's really irritating when other people bring it up, like, well, subconsciously you might be doing this. It's like, what the fuck do you know? But when I'm looking at my own self, I'm aware that there are things that I'm uncomfortable with about myself that I don't want to look at. But anyway, that's the question I keep having. Does it matter? I suppose at the end of the day, it really just doesn't matter, but it's something that keeps on kind of, I wonder where this came from. Because I do see people sometimes where it seems a little bit more like it originated in their sexuality, and then for me it seems like it originated more in my personality. And like for me, my original assumption about myself was, oh yeah, of course there's going to be sexual elements to that because I'm one whole complete person. And so there are going to be moments where my personality affects my sexuality. Which then I took that to other kinds of sexuality and tried to apply it there. So gays and lesbians who are, gender nonconforming, but not necessarily trans, they just have a tendency towards gender nonconforming behaviors. Is that driven by their sexuality, or is it driven by their personality? With gays and lesbians, and I suppose bisexuals, but bisexuals are a little bit tricky to tell, more difficult. Their sexuality it still informs their personality. It informs who they are as a person. It informs just elements of their personality. You get this subtle kind of vibe about a person, and then as they grow to adulthood, then they come out as lesbian or they come out as gay, and it's kind of like you look back and retrospectively it's like, oh yeah, I can kind of see that. At that point it's very easy to believe that sexuality is informing personality, but if it is, it's not informing personality in the way that's a lasciviousness. So I think that the thing that it would be important to think about in that sense is it's not necessarily a lascivious thing. Because when a person thinks of a sexual fetish or a paraphilia or anything like that, they think of it as kind of a lascivious thing because it's sexual, so it's got to be lascivious, right? But it doesn't seem like that. Like, for example, with a prepubescent child who is gay or lesbian, who does have, I'm trying to think of any kind of particular tendency, and I don't really know. I have relatives who were gay that I knew when we were all kids who were prepubescent. And I'm trying to think, and I also have friends who were gay that I knew before we all started like really getting hit with the puberty hormones. And I mean, I'm trying to think of any tendencies, but you do hear these stories about where it's like the parents kind of knew, like, when the kid was little. There's not a lascivious element to that because it's just a little kid being a kid. It's entirely innocent because all those parts of them are, dormant. So I think that's something to take into consideration when a person is autoandrophilic, for example, and they have these tendencies that lean very masculine, or perhaps autogynephilic, and they have tendencies that lean very feminine. They find themselves attracted to feminine things. They want to do feminine activities. And it's not... It could be informed by their sexuality. It could be that all of this is informed by a person's sexuality. So if you're not a gynephile and you find yourself wanting to do, feminine activities, just all the time, very drawn to feminine activities, you really like the color pink, it's not necessarily going to be lascivious. It could be something that's just incorporated into your personality, but the origins of it could be sexual in a less lascivious way. It's just kind of part of who you are because a person's sexuality is a part of their personality. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but this is just where my mind goes. But it's a question, so I kind of wonder, like, does anybody else have any thoughts on this? At the end of the day, it doesn't even matter, but it's a curiosity of mine. Like, I wonder, like, how does this all fit together? How does the human psyche fit together? So anyway, that's it. I'm going to try and edit this video down because there were several points at which I just kind of got lost in thought and stared out the window. But it's pretty, it's raining, so, there's that. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful week, and I will talk to you later.